Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1 dropped all the way back in 2020 with mostly positive reception, but there's still a good chunk of anime watchers that thought,
I thought it was like just okay.
I could see how a lot of people could come to that conclusion. I myself thought Season 1 had some issues that I'll touch on later, but still I thought it was a bit unfair to give such a resolute judgment on the show when it has barely even scratched the surface. You see, at the time, a few of my friends were fully caught up with the manga and I heard rumors, whispers of this thing called the Shibuya incident, and I was curious, very curious. Apparently, it was absolutely insane. But you know, I'm always skeptical about these things, so rather than wait another 3 years for more of the anime to come out, I wanted to see for myself. Was the Shibuya incident really that good? Would Season 2 be better than Season 1? Well, I caught up with the manga in a...
Let's go.
When it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1, I felt that it suffered from two notable issues. Even though I thought the characters and fights were pretty cool, these two issues kinda kept me from getting invested in the story. So what are these problems, you might ask? Well, the first is Gojo. He's too powerful. To be fair, he's actually written quite well, but you can only keep him out of the fights for so long without things feeling contrived. The second issue is the lack of direction. This one's a bit more subjective, but I didn't feel like the main characters were driving the plot very much. While we did have the end goal of collecting Sukuna's fingers, many of the beginning arcs felt very disjointed, almost episodic in nature. They mainly only served to develop the world and characters at the expense of losing focus on the pre-established goal. Luckily, this is where the Shibuya incident swoops in to save the day, fixing those two issues. And let's start with Gojo.
領域展開無料空所
So it's no secret that the artist of the series, Gege Akutami, absolutely despises Gojo. Even most of the characters in the series hate him, except for Miwa. But I think Akutami's disdain toward Gojo is understandable. When he first wrote Tokyo Metropolitan Curse Technical School, which would later become Jujutsu Kaisen 0, he intended it to be a short series. When it became insanely popular at the end of its serialization, Akutami began a sequel series, Jujutsu Kaisen. For a story like JJK0, which could fit within a movie's length, Gojo being OP isn't really too big of a problem, and it's not too difficult to write around that roadblock. Unfortunately, when you're working with a much longer series, it becomes increasingly difficult to make the villains threatening against such a powerful protagonist. Yes, I consider Gojo a protagonist because he's an extension of the main cast, and besides, the entire plot literally revolves around him. He was born and became the protagonist. Anyway, it's not impossible to balance out Gojo in a longer running series. In fact, Akutami employs some really smart writing techniques. Obviously, in Shibuya, Gojo gets completely removed from the story, but even in the first season, Gojo is expertly kept away from many of the major battles. In truth, there are many different ways to balance out an OP protagonist, each with their own pros and cons. To show you, let's start with a quintessential case study, Superman.
Hey Batman, I gotta give it to you, man. You did your thing in there. You the roast master, bro.
We all know Superman. He can fly, he's got laser vision, and he's basically invincible. That is, until you hurt him with kryptonite. This is certainly a viable solution to the overpowered protagonist, giving them a very specific weakness, but something like this can feel a bit lazy. Stories only feel cohesive when the plot, characters, and world-building elements fit within certain themes and concepts that have been pre-established. However, when you have something that only has one sole purpose within the context of the narrative, in this case, kryptonite's sole purpose is to be Superman's weakness, it tends to stand out like a sore thumb. If you want your antagonist to be able to fight back, they would need to abuse the kryptonite factor, and that tends to get stale and repetitive over the course of time. For these reasons, the kryptonite factor is usually avoided in most modern media, or it's used as a more subtle supplement to reduce a certain character's power. It's also why some Superman stories have shifted to focus on more interpersonal relationships rather than battles. Speaking of interpersonal relationships, that leads me to the next way you can balance out an overpowered protagonist. Since overpowered protagonists tend to remove all danger from battles, why not shift the focus from battles onto something else? This is where we get stuff like Mob Psycho, which is about this middle schooler who's just trying to live a normal life in spite of his ridiculously powerful psychic abilities. He gets a part-time job, he makes friends, and he joins the body improvement club to become stronger without actually using his psychic powers. He even has a crush on a girl that he's barely interacted with and too scared to talk to. By all accounts, Mob would be a regular school kid if he wasn't an Esper. At its core, Mob Psycho is a coming-of-age story that focuses on Mob growing as a person. It highlights the struggles of adolescence and social awkwardness and how this one kid learns to overcome these challenges. Sure, we have fights here and there, but they serve as vessels toward the overall theme. Underlying each fight is a message that varies between different encounters. Essentially, Mob believes one thing while the antagonist believes the opposite. Thus, the battle becomes one of thematic significance rather than just physical prowess. But what happens when your overpowered protagonist doesn't have a kryptonite factor and doesn't care too much about personal growth? How are you supposed to give a sense of stakes and urgency to the plot when a character can just one-tap any antagonist? Well, the only other option is to remove said OP character from the plot. As I said before, Akutami has always handled Gojo quite well ever since the beginning. In Jujutsu Kaisen 0, he serves as a mentor character that's a bit goofy at times. Being a mentor, he can't just save his students every time they have a difficult encounter. Gojo actively avoids interfering with Yuta during the missions, which is what allows Yuta to grow as a character. In the final act of the movie, when Geto initiates his massive attack, Gojo is preoccupied by an army of cursed spirits and some powerful Jujutsu sorcerers. Later in the main series, during the school exchange arc, a veil is created, which is specifically designed to keep out Gojo. The antagonists know they could never defeat Gojo, but the story's power system allows for them to make certain plays like this. Essentially, Gojo's existence forces villains to fight with a more tactical and thought-out plan. Even when Gojo is shown in combat, we get to see that his personality tends to get in the way of his power. He's arrogant, careless, and a bit of a showman. He even gives a chance for Jogo to be saved by Hanami. Unfortunately, you can't just arbitrarily block Gojo from each fight because he'll always find a way to get through the veil. This is why Akutami decided to press the delete button and just write Gojo out of the plot, basically. Before reading the Shibuya arc back in the day, I heard about Gojo being sealed and I was afraid that it would be something stupid and contrived, but I was blown away to see how the entire encounter went down. During the whole fight, Gojo was an absolute menace, but the villains would stop at nothing to achieve their goal, massacring innocent lives without a second thought. The villains knew that no matter how powerful Gojo might be, he could still be defeated. All they had to do was exploit one loophole in his domain expansion. It was a strategic and well thought out battle that makes logical sense within the grander narrative. Sealing Gojo is a pivotal but most importantly necessary outcome, allowing Akutami to raise the stakes in the story much higher than if Gojo was still running around freely. While Akutami always did a good job of writing Gojo's character, the culmination of the Shibuya arc shows his mastery and understanding of crafting a good narrative. Now, let's move on to the next issue. For most of the first season, I felt that the story lacked much direction. It's fine to see Yuji learning about cursed powers in the beginning, but stuff like the Kyoto Goodwill event arc and the Death Painting arc are so disconnected from each other. I also can't ignore how the first part of season 2 is just Gojo and Geto's backstory. Despite how much I enjoyed that section of the story, it's quite jarring when we suddenly step away from the current narrative for an entire arc. For the anime, the shift in focus is less jarring since it occurs at the beginning of a new season, but when reading the manga, it suddenly goes back in time with no warning. Now, as much as I gripe about Jujutsu Kaisen's beginning arcs, they do serve a crucial purpose in the wider narrative. They serve to develop the main characters and expand the world building. If we look at the arcs from that lens, they do a stellar job. Unfortunately, the main characters really aren't driving the plot. In writing, we call these passive characters. Instead of proactively working toward a goal, they simply react to whatever's happening around them, and they're often just told what to do. Generally, you want to avoid writing a passive character because it isn't very compelling to watch somebody sit around and do whatever other people tell them to do. When we look at Yuji, we see that he mostly just does what he's assigned to do, but still I have to acknowledge that he has a bit of agency within the story. Even though he himself doesn't drive the plot, he still makes choices that affect his own life. For instance, in his first encounter with Mahito, Yuji's ideals are directly challenged, but he chooses to stay strong with his beliefs. This is why this fight against Mahito is one of my favorite parts of Season 1. It's also crucial to note that choices is the key word here. It's what defines characters. Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara are passive characters in most of the overall plot, but they're still active within their own lives, making crucial choices that keep them mostly engaging. Such a setup is great and all, but it tends to stale the plot eventually. Usually, if a character starts off passive, they end up growing more active as the story progresses, but that takes quite a while to happen in JJK. Also, when I look back at Season 1, there was no real major character arc that anybody accomplished. No major character ever undergoes a significant change in beliefs. Sure, the main characters are challenged, and even Yuji and Nobara have to come to terms with murdering two brothers, but in the end, everyone mostly stays the same. This is why, in the first season of JJK, it doesn't feel like much progress is actually made, not until the Shibuya arc. To fully understand how the story of JJK is structured, we need to take a step back and look at the show more holistically. Jujutsu Kaisen, much like almost every other piece of Japanese fiction, follows a certain story structure called Kisho Tenketsu. This particular story structure is like the East Asian equivalent of the hero's journey in the West. It's everywhere. Despite having studied fiction writing for a while, I actually only discovered Kisho Tenketsu pretty recently, and it's quite interesting. When it comes to Japan, South Korea, and China, much of their story structure originated from ancient Chinese poetry that was written in 4 lines. It was called
起承转合.
The structure moved to Korea and subsequently moved to Japan, where it became Kisho Tenketsu, a story that's written with 4 key sections. These sections are Ki, Sho, Ten, and Ketsu. Ki is the introduction. This is your hook that's designed to capture the audience's attention while introducing the main characters. Next is Sho, which is the rising action. Here we get to see the characters in the world develop, but there aren't any major changes so far. Everything here is just build up toward the third section, which is Ten, the twist. This climactic moment of the story serves to recontextualize everything that has already been shown to us, upending the status quo. The last section is Ketsu, the resolution. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's the part where the story wraps up. If you have been listening closely, you may have realized that Kisho Tenketsu doesn't necessarily need a major conflict or even an active protagonist to drive the plot forward. Unlike the hero's journey, which has an inciting incident and usually a major antagonist, Kisho Tenketsu doesn't really require either of things, though it certainly helps. Therefore, the story structure lends itself much better for character-driven stories instead of something like a superhero trying to save the world. To give a more concrete example of the Kisho Tenketsu story structure, let's look at Your Name. This movie follows the pattern to a T. When the movie starts, we're introduced to our 2 protagonists, Mitsuha and Taki, and we find out they can switch bodies. This is Ki, the introduction. As you can see, there's no real antagonist here. We're basically just introduced to the main characters and the main concept of the plot. Next, we get into Sho, the rising action. As Mitsuha and Taki continually switch bodies, they set ground rules and start communicating with each other regularly. Mitsuha, in Taki's body, sets up a date with Taki's coworker. Meanwhile, Taki helps Mitsuha gain more popularity in school. But suddenly, the body swapping stops. So when Taki goes to investigate with his friends, they discover the big twist. Mitsuha's town was destroyed by a comet 3 years ago. From there, Taki must find a way to save the past, culminating in the ending when he finally accomplishes that goal. Yup, it follows Kisho Tenketsu quite neatly. Of course, that story structure isn't exclusive to anime. Movies like Parasite and Joker are written in similar ways. If you've seen either of those movies, you could probably identify how each of them have no overarching antagonists and instead build toward a massive twist or turning point in the story. Now, let's overlay the concept of Kisho Tenketsu over JJK. The first season and the first part of the second season both serve as the introduction and rising action. Then we get to the Shibuya incident, which is the big twist. Do note here that JJK doesn't have the conclusion section because the story still continues for a lot more arcs. Anyway, Shibuya was the one moment where I felt like the story finally came together. For a movie, it's easier to get away with having a bit of a disjointed rising action section because that medium is shorter by nature. For a longer running series, having disjointed pacing can be detrimental to engagement. This is why many mangaka try to include miniature twists before the massive world-changing twist. In fact, if you look at Attack on Titan, each season builds toward one crazy twist. The end of Season 3 is what I would consider to be one of the largest climaxes in the series, and Season 4, or whatever the season's called these days, is the concluding quarter. This part of the narrative is meant to wrap up everything that came before it. Hopefully it does that well. For Jujutsu Kaisen, I don't think the lack of cohesion in the beginning brings down the series too much, but it's noticeable. Luckily, we do get tiny hints about the villains plotting. They mentioned that they would be attacking Shibuya during Halloween, and that would be when they finally turn the tables. By the time the Shibuya incident occurs, it completely recontextualizes everything I knew about Season 1 because I realized the villains were the real ones who were driving the plot forward. The heroes only want to preserve humanity, but the special grade curses actively work toward their goal of wiping out civilization. Their plan involves two main objectives, sealing Gojo and becoming allies with Sukuna. Now that Gojo is sealed, the sorcerers have to scramble to make sure they don't lose this crucial battle. With the stakes having been raised and the bad guys having made their move, the story has really gained a significant sense of direction. Each member of the main cast must push themselves to the limit to survive this deadly gauntlet they've been trapped in. The Shibuya arc truly breathes new life to the series. Having sufficiently gushed about the Shibuya incident arc, I will say it's not perfect by any means. I just find it astounding how Akutami has been building up toward this one massive moment and how he has utilized it with equally massive effectiveness. As for what comes after Shibuya, yeah, the Fortnite arc is a bit of a doozy. But anyway, now that Gojo has been sealed in the prison realm, it really gives all the characters a chance to actually develop. In turn, the Shibuya arc gives a new sense of purpose in the narrative now that the stakes are raised and the villains have revealed their goals. But there's one thing I failed to mention. A third, bonus story issue that the Shibuya arc fixes perfectly. Can you guess what it is? Yup, that's right. May finally get some more screen time.
Manifest destiny, ain't no secret recipe. 9 to 5 grind just to get a little cheddar cheese. New confidence, that's a brand new side of me. Feeling so high, that's a hometown remedy.